Thank you. I've been told I've got less time than I thought I had for this talk, so I'm going to have to do some speed talking at the moment and speed showing of the PowerPoints. Now, I'm told that a lot of people in this room have not actually know the story about the St. John's chancel ceiling stars, so I'm going to do a little bit of introduction to that. If you go down to the church, you will get a lovely, you can purchase for about $10 a lovely brochure which has the starry ceiling in it and a little bit of the story. Or if you have gone to Chapters and purchased a copy of J. Ingram's Daily Planet book, we have 6 whole pages here on the story of the St. John stars. Stephen Hawking gets 2. What the heck? Okay, so, all right, so what? Give me some instructions. Just the space bar, you said? Okay, fine. This is a recent picture of St. John's, taken last year. And here is a picture taken about 20 years before that. You may notice there's no change between the two pictures, but in fact the church has been rebuilt since that time. Back around early 1900s, it actually looked a little bit different coloration, shall we say. The black trim wasn't so solid back then. So you can see, but it has been essentially the same church since the last modifications made in 1889. Electric lighting was added in 1900, but the horrible things happened just after 9/11. In 2001, there was a Halloween arson event which destroyed the church and left it in ruins. The congregation decided to restore the church to its original form using as much of the original as possible. And the reason probably is because it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can see that, as you can see from the shots after the fire, that it was quite a desolation. Now, a lot of the material, the pews, for example, have been returned to the new church, and there are scars of the fire still visible, if you ask. But this is the remains of the chancel where the star pattern was, the Church of the Stars. This is the original chancel as seen from the nave. Now, I'm never sure whether or not you can see it or not, but if you look on that panel in the center, that's the eastern panel. It points towards the east. North is on the left, south to the right. You can see some little white spots, which are the stars. There was, in fact, a photographic record back then, and don't worry about the coloration. I tried to enhance the little white spots so they could come out more visibly. You can see them a little bit better in this shot, I think. Yes, there are stars there. And when Era Studios got the contract in 2004 for restoring the painting in the church, they noticed that when they looked at the actual star scenes, they didn't look like they were randomized. There was, in fact, a clump. This is the one that was most striking for me. This shot of the eastern panel, unfortunately, there's an obscuration by a chain hanging for the lamp that's hanging down from the ceiling, but otherwise you can see that there is indeed a little clump there, which caught my eye. More easily visible in this photo. Trouble is the stars were gilded, so they don't show up very easily except with direct lighting coming on them at night. You have to have that 180-degree light coming in and light coming back out in order to see them easily. Otherwise, they're obscured and faint. Now, the chancel is not a true dome or anything like that. It's not a sphere. It's, in fact, a 5-sided apse. So there's flat sections there, although it looks like they are curved because of the arches that they've got built into the support structure. There are 2 all-sky views. This is one of them. And you'll notice that it may be an all-sky view, but you don't see all the sky. And this is what I had to go on. They plopped down one of these photos. I think it might have been this one on my desk and then said, go to it. on the spot. Here's another all-sky view, and you can see that right overhead is this fan structure. I'll show you in a second that is where the constellation of Cassiopeia would have been if it weren't for the fan. So this is what I did. I actually reversed the contrast so I could see reverse the colors so I could see what I was looking at more easily. And I noticed a clump, and it looks a lot like the constellation of Perseus. I'll leave it there for a second. I'm not going to leave it there for too long because if you look for too long, you'll notice all these stars aren't in the right place and all that kind of stuff. But there is a clump, and it does look like Perseus. I spent 6 years directing a planetarium in Sudbury, so I know my constellations pretty well. And besides, this is one of my favorite parts of the sky. I'm a star cluster expert, and this is the Alpha Persei cluster right there. Ancient Chi Persei are a little bit further north, and then we've got down below, we've got the Pleiades and then the Hyades cluster. Heck, it's loaded with star clusters. So one of the things is that when you look at the sky today, say, look at the eastern sky, Perseus doesn't go through the eastern sky. So how could they have a view of Perseus going through the eastern sky when it doesn't quite make it today? No problem. All you have to do is go back 2,000 years when Perseus was 10 degrees further from the celestial pole, and bingo, it actually goes through the eastern sky back in that era. So even though it can go through the eastern sky at any time during the day, now we have to find out the actual time. So the implication is the pattern is actually a true star scene, and it's from 2,000 years ago. It's not from the modern era. The orientation of the sky is more or less eastward, coincident with the actual orientation of the church, as you can see. But for what day? Perseus goes through there every day. Bang, 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 bang. So I got an interesting suggestion, actually, from Margaret Coolin, who suggested to me that maybe it represents Advent, the month of Sundays preceding Christmas. And so, and another thing is, in Jewish tradition, the day ends at sunset, which also marks the beginning of the next day. So I decided to try this out for myself. Why not go to Christmas Eve, marking the end of Advent, and brought up the sky, and lo and behold, wow, the Perseus was there at sunset, and it's in the right configuration. It's the right orientation for a latitude of Lunenburg. Now, sunset, of course, you can't see the stars. But this, of course, is the beginning of the first Christmas, December 24th, 180. So this was what the sky scene originally had represented, the beginning of the first Christmas. But they didn't know that. It was called the mariner's sky, which has always puzzled me. In fact, if you look at is Dave Lane here in the universe? Anyway, Earth-centered universe, the picture for sunset on December 24th, you can see the stars of Perseus, and you'll notice that there aren't very many other clumps around, except for Cassiopeia, which again is lost in the rafters there in the fan operation, and maybe down here in the Hyades maybe, but that's below the horizon. And I should note, by the way, there's actually a 30-degree cutoff from the horizon because of the walls of the chancel actually are that far up. I used my hand gauge, my 20-degree hand gauge, and estimated that. So we've only got from 30 degrees above the horizon up. We don't have the whole sky. We don't have overhead. We're missing the whole western section. So that was what I had to do. Of course, by the way, the birth of Christ does certainly not occur on the evening of December 24th, 180. That was the accepted view for many people 2 centuries ago. Nowadays, we'd probably date it somewhere between 6 and 2 BCE, probably in February or March, but even that varies from one author to another. Now, there were some mysteries immediately, which were kind of, who designed this originally? No one was taking credit for it. There's nothing in the church records at all. We'll see later who we think it might be. And then there was this thing which I was told, make sure there are 700 stars in your plan because that's how many stars there were originally. There were 700 stars up there. Someone counted them. It sounds like an Ottawa bureaucratic nightmare. And in fact, it may have been. They actually had I think they brought down a consultant from Ottawa to do an inventory for the church, and they actually counted the number of stars in the chancel ceiling. That was sometime in the 1980s or something like that. There was another thing which was taunted. Ron Cahoon, who was the contractor for the reconstruction, used to taunt me with, hey, wait, what about that great Star of the East? He had it on a big thing on his wall, a big blow-up of this on his wall. There was this blurry thing, which, believe it or not, was actually in the east, because as I discovered later, the church is actually skewed about 5 degrees from a true east-west orientation, so this is exactly where east would have been. And so I thought, well, is this an actual star? Huh? And I worried about that for a moment. Maybe it was smudged out or something like that. But no, it turns out that this star is just a reflection off of the lamp hanging down. How many of you are old enough to remember the great Aries flasher of the early 80s? Yeah. Something like that maybe, but no, it's a different origin. Now, who did it? When did they do it? And there's this history by Cyril Reed in 1967, which says that a man by the name of Page was the great courageous soul who painted the blue chancel ceiling with its stars and probably the east wall. This is the only record we have of who painted the ceiling, a man by the name of Page. This is actually a bit controversial because on one website it says a woman by the name of Page. Nope. There is, in fact, in an itemization of the expenses for the painting, a note. Well, this somehow got moved a bit, but it says that a page was paid. Page's bill is down there for £43, 10 shillings. That's about $220. It might have been more than what the rector of the church was earning per year as salary. I know that the organist was getting $75 a year at that time. So we looked up pages. I had a history student one summer who looked up and found a John Page recorded in the 1871 census for Lunenburg County. He was 41 years old at the time, a resident of Bridgewater, and he was a painter. The only other Pages in Lunenburg County at that time were farmers and the like. So we think that John Page was the person. So I went on the TV, and John Tatry, on a plea back in 2009 asking for any information about John Page, if anyone could find it. And it turns out that if you go into online, you can actually check the British census records, and it turns out that there was a John Page, a house painter, born in Hammersmith, which is West London, in 1831. He was listed in the 1861 British census. I think this may be the person. And following a talk that I gave, as I say, there was feedback that came from one Elizabeth Taylor. And I know what you're thinking, but no, it's not the same person. She, former Blue Noser living in Upper Canada somewhere, I think it's Ottawa maybe, who searched the online database and found that the record of the death of a man named John Page in age 40, from England, born in England. He was a widower, and he died in the poor asylum of paralysis in 1872, just after the church was reconsecrated. And now paralysis is a pseudonym for just about anything, a stroke, polio, syphilis, things like that. The actual description of the ceiling, there is, in the church records, they have beside the date for the reconsecration, they've got I've pasted a newspaper clipping. You can see how large the newspaper clipping is describing the church in all its glory. And there's this one sentence which describes the ceiling. The ceiling is blue, studded with stars of gold. So the stars date from those renovations. There's no rationale given for the design or anything else. We have searching the records. There's other things too that have been a mystery, like sometimes we don't see the stars in images from that day. There's an actual star, a photographic reproduction that they sometimes put on display in the church, which shows the chancel and its ceiling and the boards, but it doesn't show any stars. And there's another shot that they have too, taken on the commemoration of the death of Edward VII in 1910, which when you look peek behind the flags and look on the boards, you don't see any indication of stars. So we were wondering one time, do the gilded stars actually disappear, come and go, or something like that, or it's just the photographic techniques that couldn't record them back then. So what I did basically was just to provide new plans. If you're asking how did you do that, I used ECU, I cheated, but if I had to do it in a pinch, I would just take my old handy-dandy star finder and change the pivot point for precession, and that would do it just as well, probably. I actually didn't count to 700. There wasn't enough time for one thing, and the Aristides was starting to get asked frequent questions. I included a 5-degree tilt askew from the east. I'm not sure why now that I look back on it. But I didn't do anything. All the hard work was done by Julie Jane Coulin and her parents. In fact, her father, Reed, did the scaling so that she could put them on the new chancel ceiling. See that lovely deep blue? It looks black when you're there. This is the result. You're not going to see this if you go to the church today. They put in new lighting, which obscures the view, unfortunately. But it's actually quite beautiful. And the stars are 8-pointed stars, which I wondered about. Both the people we think were responsible for this had access to Jameson's Star Atlas, which a copy of which was held by King's College. But the stars in Jameson's are not 8-pointed, nor are they in Bode's Atlas or any of the others that were of that era. So I'm not sure where this star design came from. And this is me and Julie Jane admiring the new star pattern back during a press conference in October 2004 at the church. Today it's a glorious church. The first shot that you saw would give you some idea. It's a warm church in the interior. It's quite nice to tour. They have tour guides there, I think almost constantly through the summer months, at least till 5 o'clock. And here are some recent views with the church minister, Reverend Michael Mitchell, actually Archdeacon, and my wife, with me trying to just show them what's there in the sky. If you do go down there, the eastern sky shows Perseus. The panels around it, of course, are some of the obscure constellations. Camelopardalis, right? Triangulum. These are not exciting groups. Aries, maybe, yeah. Pleiades was there, yes. Julie Jane actually enlarged that, took artistic license to make it look like something. The north sky is not so bad. JJ actually brought Polaris onto the left of the two panels there so that all the Little Dipper would be together. But of course, Ursa Major, Big Dipper was below the horizon. There's nothing much to see. I find that the south panels are more interesting because you got the Great Square of Pegasus. You've also got Pisces, which is more interesting because it's the sign of the era. We're in the Piscean era right now. Jesus was born at the beginning of the Piscean era, so we're still going on. Now, recent work, which has concentrated on two people, primarily, we think may be responsible. One is Hibbert Binney, who was the Bishop of Nova Scotia at the time, born in Nova Scotia, but his parents quickly moved back to England. He was raised there, got his education at King's College in London. He had a BA in mathematics and classics from Oxford in 1842 and got promoted to BMA later. In fact, he was at Oxford at the time of his appointment by Joe Howe in 1851 as Bishop of Nova Scotia. Interestingly enough, he had higher grades in mathematics than in classics, and mathematics of that era included a lot of spherical astronomy. We've checked the final examinations from that era, and yes, it's all navigation primarily in spherical astronomy, sun and moon in the sky, things of that type. He had all the natural abilities to work on this. I think he was too busy. He was a Tractarian in an era when Nova Scotia was low church, and he brought his high church ideals to Nova Scotia with some resistance locally. But he could have designed the star pattern. The other person is the church minister at the time, Reverend Henry Owen, also educated in England at the Blue Coat School, although he was born in Halifax. He got his further education at King's College, Windsor. He was originally planning on going to Cambridge, but had to come home. And at King's College, in that area, they did teach spherical trig and navigation for a lot of their graduates. So he had the training as well, I believe. Now comes the vital clue that we've been haunted by for the last year. In the St. John's Church minutes for June 13th, 1867, resolved that a chancel be built as large as practicable to accommodate both the chair and vestry. The Honorable John Creighton expressed great desire to have the ceiling torn down and finished similar to that of the Episcopal Church in Liverpool, to which he offered to subscribe $200, provided that the shingling, painting, and the repairs be paid for by the remainder of the congregation. Now, the timeline for this is appropriate. You should know it. Actually, in 1866, Owen asked for an addition of a chancel to the church. If you were on the Tide and Wines tour the other day, you at the Covenanter Church that we saw, it would have been like what St. John's was in that era, a square with a big, large pulpit. He asked for a chancel, but was turned down. Cost money. So, yeah, the front end of the church where the cross and
where the altar is.
Yeah. So he didn't get anywhere with his congregation, so he called in the big guns and brought in Binney, a sailing trip down from Halifax to visit the church in May in 1867, and he asked for changes to be made. Well, they listened to Binney. Besides, I think John Creighton was a distant cousin of Binney's, so Creighton offered the money. They went for it, and so the remodeling began in 1870 to 1872, and the new church was consecrated by Binney. And they had by the way, there had been a previous church in interestingly enough, in Nova Scotia that had added a chancel previously. The Trinity Church in Liverpool had added a chancel in 1861, so they wanted to catch up a bit. But this similar to that of the Episcopal Church in Liverpool. So what Liverpool are we going to go by? Well, here's Trinity Anglican Church in Liverpool, Nova Scotia, which dates, I'm not sure when it dates from it, but the chancel that you see on the end was added in 1861. This end here on the eastern end, as it is. Unfortunately, if you look at it closely, curved. It's not quite, it doesn't look at anything like at all like St. John's. So this is not like St. John's. So this is, I don't think, the model for St. John's. However, it was Randall who came up with this church, Liverpool's Church of Our Lady and St. Nicholas. This is Liverpool, England. And it, known locally as the Sailors' Church or simply St. Nick's, the original was actually destroyed long ago. This is recent scenes of it. What I can try and do is show you shots from the library photographs that they have, or library drawings that they have in Liverpool. St. Nicholas Church and Chapel. The reason why it's called Our Lady and St. Nicholas is because there was another chapel right next to it, St. Mary del Kay Chapel, which was demolished in 1814. So I guess the original St. Nicholas absorbed both of them. And why is this important? Because, as it says in A Stranger in Liverpool, a guide to Liverpool, in 1774, the old church was altered by a faculty. This church actually had stars on its ceiling. So we think this is, they were painted in gilt, and we think this, it had other things besides stars. Unfortunately, it had clouds, it had the sun, the moon, things of that type. Unfortunately, those were taken down in 1774. They'd been put up in 1688. So neither Binney nor Owen were alive when the stars were on the ceiling, but they may have seen records of it. This is, again, in the St. Nicholas Church and Churchyard. So the rationale that we're going by is that this is the oldest church in Liverpool. It did have a chapel ceiling which is painted and starred. Although it was removed in 1774. St. Nicholas, by the way, is the patron saint for mariners. So this was the mariners' church. Okay, does this sound familiar? And in fact, the mariners would come by the statue, leave offerings for underneath the statue of St. Nicholas before setting to sea. So if you want a church with a mariner sky in it, it was this church here. So that's what I'm asking. Were Binney and or Owen familiar with the old mariner sky at St. Nicholas, seeking to replicate it at St. John's? Both were trained in spherical astronomy, so would have been able to create the design, as they say. In fact, Owen is known to have created a rather interesting map of Cross Island. Cross Island is an island that sort of guards Lunenburg Bay on the Atlantic Ocean. And he visited there in 1869 and did a lovely map of the island, which was described as a fine piece of art by one of the writers of the history of the church, Gardner. This was a year before construction began, and I'm thinking that perhaps he decided to create another fine piece of work, namely a plan for the ceiling, which was carried out by John Page in typical craftsmanship era way, namely they didn't go by a design, they went by memory. So that's why the stars in the original ceiling constellation of Perseus are not quite exactly all where they belong. The other thing which is interesting, or a clue, is the fact that Owen's birthday is December 24th. And I'm thinking that the original star scene that he put up there and never mentioned anywhere, these two people, Binney and Owen both, did not publish much, did not publish at all. They didn't leave much record behind. And so that's why I think that it might be Owen. And now, tag team match.
Where's our technical guy? Well, look at that. This is going to be a shortened version. If I talk too fast, too bad. David has covered a lot of the basics very, very well, which makes a lot of sense because he was there before I was. You see the title slide? That's probably a better slide for this. The t-shirt will be available later at the banquet. More to the point is this. The first thing I'm going to do is give you a survey of what's out there in the way of celestial ceilings. So it'll give you a context in which to place a St. John's ceiling. How rare is it? What's the matrix from which it developed? It doesn't mean that these guys who were responsible, whoever was responsible for the St. John's ceiling, actually saw these, but they might have. So we're going to start with Nero. Lovely man. Nero was not a nice man. However, what he did is he was responsible for this. In his great golden palace, the golden house, Domus Aurea, he put a planetarium. This was the main, this is the Octagon room, main room. It's got an oculus, which is open to the heavens, and a celestial ceiling, which turns. And it's described by Suetonius as actually imitating the movements of the heavens. And the thing turns night and day, which is pretty impressive if you think about it, but Roman engineering was pretty good.
What power source? 4 squirrels.
Come on. Probably water. There we go. A couple of CGI. Oh, damn it. Okay, let's go back. Back is which way? No, wrong way. My other left. That's it.
This is going to speed up the talk quite a bit.
Oh, I'm sure it will. Come on, you. Well, there's a delay with this thing. There we go. Oh. In a couple of minutes, it should come up. CGI reconstructions. What? Jeez. I should have done this with finger puppets. Finally, you see, there are differences in these CGI reconstructions. That's because what they have are verbal descriptions, and they're pretty concise. So, what survives? What survives, will this work, is this. You've got the space. You've got the oculus open there. Apparently, some of the mechanism was discovered in 2012. Some of the stuff that made this go around was actually discovered. What's lacking here is the actual celestial ceiling, how it was decorated, which is too bad. This is actually a really good place to start, partly because Nero is such a fascinating character. You wouldn't want him on a committee if you're in a department. Binney and Owen would have been aware of this ceiling because they were both trained in classics, and they would have had to read the works that have this description. There's another connection. The celestial ceiling in St. John's is placed in a banquet hall. Eucharist, you have the Mass, Last Supper, it's a banquet hall. This too was a banquet hall. There's that connection. Third connection is that this thing does not survive in very good shape. And of course, it just illustrates how contingent, how fragile something which looks like a monumental work, a monumental piece, a monumental artifact of cultural astronomy. Just with chance, just with fire, just with flood or neglect, these things can be at risk, as happened with the fire at St. John's. Oh, it actually worked. So, here's one where the celestial ceiling actually survives. Mausoleum of Galla Placidia, she was an empress, lived a really fascinating life. Google her. 425 to 426. This represents, you can divide celestial ceilings into three types. The first type, and it's the most numerous, you get stars, gold stars in a blue ground. Where have you heard that before? So you've got these gold stars in a blue ground, there's no pattern. Or the pattern that's there does not reflect. It doesn't reflect what you see in the night sky. There's no attempt to make it mimetic in that way. You just get the suggestive thing of gold stars on a blue ground. And maybe. Here's another example, San Marco. Again there, you've got Christ, he's sitting on a rainbow, supposedly. There's gold stars, blue ground, same thing here. It's a hexameral thing, 6 days of creation. And look, there's another one. This is a Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Some of you have seen it, 1240s. More. Blue background, gold stars. Those are actually fleur-de-lis. French king, you get it. Now, this is the most common type of celestial ceiling you see. It didn't disappear with Copernicus, because this dates from 1881. The same idea. This is a Leadenhall market. Some of you may have seen this in London. The stars are different sizes. So, maybe, are they trying to indicate magnitudes? No. This is a view of the night sky you'll see from nowhere on Earth. There we go, yes. Second type of celestial ceiling. This is Renaissance, 1573, 1574, Sala de Mappamondo, so Hall of the World Map, in the Palazzo Farnese. So what you have here is there is an attempt to place the stars as one could see them in the night sky. Not as accurate as one would wish now, but there is that attempt. You get zodiacal figures or asterisms. And these seem to date from, say, 14th century on. It's a more sophisticated way of going about it. Here's another example. Not much more to say about it. Well, I will say one thing. There's an astrological component to these. Not a surprise. Did this die out with say, the scientific revolution? No. This is in the council chamber of Mississauga. 1987, and even it's an Ojibwe story. It's related to the Mi'kmaq story, which you might hear more about tonight. The same idea of some sort of mimetic, so some sort of imitation of what you see at the night sky. This isn't as accurate as the Renaissance ones, but I could say in connection there that Mississauga's Renaissance potentate recently resigned. Third type of celestial ceiling is a type that the St. John ceiling in Lunenburg belongs to. This is an example in England, Beverley St. Mary's Church. I think it's a 14th or 15th century church. Of course, these things get continually added to and rebuilt. It's like what you do to a professional telescope. You improve it with time. Anyways, they decided to put in the vestry, God knows why they put it there, because the only people who normally go to a vestry are people who do the liturgy. So the congregation wouldn't necessarily see this. They put in a celestial ceiling there, and that is actually an attempt to represent the night sky. Put in probably 1865, it's not precessed back any time. This is the epoch, the same epoch in which it was actually placed. So it's not like the St. John's ceiling. Upshot of all this, St. John's Lunenburg ceiling is doubly unique. Belongs to the rarest form, the most unusual form of celestial ceiling, where they actually try to represent what's there without using the figures of the zodiac. And it represents a particular epoch. So it's quite a rare thing. It's doubly rare because it's the only one precessed back 2,000 years, as far as we know. Perhaps the one in Liverpool was. No way of knowing that now. So all this stuff depends on one passage in Matthew's Gospel, where they talk about the star from the east. It appears 3 times in that one Gospel. It's a really short passage, and of course, in popular culture and in learned culture, these things, you have something that's very short, all these biblical stories, they get magnified somehow as they're told and retold. Brings up an interesting story. Are you going to change? I push the button. I'm having the problem that the Seabrooks had yesterday with a slow computer. Can you imagine you're putting up, in an Anglican church, 1870, you're putting up a celestial ceiling. It's supposed to be the Last Supper you're commemorating. Why would you not put in the Star of Bethlehem? People think about this. It's the one. The reading comes on. I mean, Christmas season, or maybe it's Epiphany. That reading from Matthew about the Star of Bethlehem gets star billing in the Gospel of the day. People knew this. So if you're putting that in, and again, popular culture, Star of Bethlehem. It's got the moon there. Why would you put the ceiling in, and if it represents that particular day, birth of Christ, and not put the star in? To answer that, well, I mean, you could say that if you didn't want to avoid answering it, you could say that, well, they put that ceiling in at St. John's just for decoration. There's an empty space. So imagine 19th century Martha Stewart in Lunenburg. She goes in, she notices that there's this empty space in the chancel. So later that night, when she goes to the polite pub on the wharf, and she's there with her acolytes, or his acolytes, she says, look, there's an empty space there. We could put sparkly stars. We'll precess them back 2,000 years, just in time for Christmas. I don't find that particularly satisfying, and I suspect David doesn't either as an explanation. So the place to go is Anglican theological works which people like Binney and Owen would have read in 1870. This man here does not date from 1870. His lifetime overlapped that of Elizabeth I and James I. He was a renowned speaker. This guy knew a whole bunch of languages. He was a friend of Francis Bacon, for those of you who want a science anchor for this. Quite an amazing guy. His sermons have been continuously available since they appeared in the early 17th century. 2 of his sermons, well, actually more than 2, deal with the Star of Bethlehem. And he says several things. What he says is, forget about the real star. It was a celestial phenomenon. It was back then. It's gone. It's never going to come back. However, he said that, how would I put this? If the believer actually has Christ in their heart, then in a way, if Christ is, and he goes on and draws a comparison that Christ is the Star of Bethlehem, they have their faith, means they believe in Christ, they have their witness, so they're holding Christ in their heart through their faith. The moment they enter the church, there is the Star of Bethlehem because they're carrying it here. Even more compelling, according to these arguments, what the Star of Bethlehem, the way it functions, according to him, is that it's a sign. It's a sign, right? So you've got the star, shows you where the manger is, wise men and shepherds can go visit. Star of Bethlehem is a signifier for where Christ is. Well, the place where they put the reserved sacrament, so you do your Eucharist, you consecrate your bread, you've got the reserved sacrament, Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, whatever. Those were often decorated with a star stuck on them. So it's like a box, got a star on it. That star is functioning as the Star of Bethlehem, showing you where Christ is and the consecrated bread. That also means, and this is really interesting, that also means that every time Mass is performed in that space, the chancel of St. John's, if Christ is actually the Star of Bethlehem, then every time Mass is performed, the Star of Bethlehem is there because Christ is there in the host. There was no need to paint the Star of Bethlehem for anyone knowing this symbolism because it was there. And it's nice because it was there functionally. People are actually doing stuff. And it's in the doing of that stuff and in their belief that the Star of Bethlehem happens. It also means that you've got right where the altar is. Those of you who go visit the church, you'll see the altar is, and that's where the main action is. It's like being at the coude focus of a, the coude focus of a professional telescope is where the action is. And over that, as a backdrop for all this stuff, you've got the celestial ceiling. It's actually a really good piece of design. It's the backdrop which suggests a richness to what's happening with the liturgical action. That's enough of the theology. It's a Sunday. I'm not a preacher. David mentioned mysteries. Mysteries, yes. Well, most of these mysteries, there's nothing to do with Dan Brown and that rubbish, most of these mysteries are solely because we don't have the information. Didn't survive. People didn't write it down, which is curious, but I mean, just historical attrition, stuff that you think would be important. You think, why didn't these people write this stuff down? They didn't because they didn't think it was important at the time, or the stuff got lost. So, turn to Rosenfeld, Laws of Research into Astronomical History and Heritage. The more promising source appears, the greater will be your disappointment upon pursuing it. 2, an inverse relationship obtains between proximity to the creation of the artifact and loquacity about its creation. Who writes this stuff? What's going on here is that the people who you think would be most likely to know what happened in the past, the people closest to the event, the actors who made the thing happen, tend not to write about it often, unfortunately. And finally, the most interesting aspects of an artifact giving rise to the most pressing questions are those aspects least likely to survive in the documentary record. And, as Douglas Adams' character, Ford Prefect, would say, terrific. So David also mentioned the fact that it's ridiculous. If this thing was so important and unique, why is the sole contemporary notice of it? Well, we put in this church newspaper, I think it was a church newspaper, blue background, gold stars. It tells you nothing. It doesn't tell you anything about its uniqueness. There's a possible explanation for their reticence. 1847, John Ruskin publishes The Stones of Venice. In that book, there's a chapter called The Nature of Gothic. It was also published separately. Incredibly influential in the sort of church circles that Binney and Owen traveled in, and with all types of people. People like William Morris a little later, all types of people in England, looking at ecclesiology, how you should build a church. People have read Ruskin's words as saying that the most valuable sort of craftsmanship you can do, the most valuable sort of way you can contribute to something materially and spiritually is anonymously. And he goes back to, you look at these medieval craftsmen. They often didn't sign their works. They did as well as they could. They did their best effort. Some of it was inventive, some of it was following lines already laid down, but it was an anonymous sort of offering. If that sort of celebration of anonymity as a virtue was put forth at that time, it's possible that influenced the people who designed the celestial ceiling at St. John's. That it wasn't negligence, they didn't sign it. It was on purpose. And that's it. You happy, Paul?